I want you to picture a tent, high on a bare mountain slope, half buried in snow. It's the dead of a Siberian winter, 30 degrees below zero, and this tent has been cut open, not from the outside, from the inside. Whoever was in there took a knife to the canvas and tore their way out and then walked calmly barefoot into the dark. 9 people. Not one of them came back. For 60 years, that single detail, cut from the inside, drove an entire country half mad trying to explain it. There were theories about secret weapons, about aliens, about a yeti, and almost every one of them was wrong, because when the truth finally came, it was quieter than any of that. And honestly, it was so much sadder. So let me tell you what really happened on Dead Mountain. They were kids mostly. Students from a polytechnic institute in the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk, sharp, athletic, the kind of friends who finish each other's sentences. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, a radio engineering student, so good with his hands that he built the stove that heated their tent himself. With him were 8 others, among them Zina, bright and warm and the heart of the group, and Lyudmila Dubinina, the youngest, just 20. Now I need you to understand something about these 9 because it matters more than anything else in this story. They were not reckless tourists. This trip was rated Category 3, the highest difficulty the Soviet system had. Every one of them had survived hard winter tour before. They knew snow. They knew cold. They knew exactly how dangerous a mountain in February could be. Hold on to that, because everything they did on their last night was the opposite of panic. There's one more name you need, Yuri Yudin, because 10 of them set out, not 9. A few days in, an old joint condition of Yudin's flared up so badly he physically couldn't go on. So at the last little outpost before the wild, he said goodbye. There's a photograph of that exact moment, Yudin, half smiling, a little embarrassed, hugging Lyudmila in the snow while the others load the sleds. He was annoyed, gutted to be missing the adventure. He had no idea that the illness he was cursing had just saved his life. Every single person he hugged that morning had less than 2 weeks left. Yudin would spend the rest of his life, 50 more years, as the 10th man, the one who turned back. From there, the 9 pushed north toward a peak called Otort. And here's something that makes this story almost unbearable to tell. We know what those last days looked like, because they kept diaries, and they took photographs, rolls and rolls of them. We have the pictures, them laughing, goofing around in the snow, building camp, sharing a single blanket against the cold. There is nothing ominous in these images. That's the hard part. They're just happy young people on a trip with their friends. And then you reach the final frames on the roll, and a few of them are almost completely dark, blurred shapes in a blizzard, the light failing. The very last photographs any of them would ever take. On the afternoon of February 1st, they made a decision people have argued about ever since. Instead of dropping down into the tree line where the forest would have sheltered them from the wind, they pitched their tent out in the open, on the exposed shoulder of the mountain. The local Mansi people had a name for that mountain, Kholat Syakhl. It translates almost too perfectly to Dead Mountain. Now, it wasn't a crazy call. Dyatlov probably didn't want to give up the altitude they'd fought for, only to reclimb it in the morning. It's the kind of small, reasonable decision experienced people make all the time. And to pitch a flat tent on a slope, they did the normal thing. They cut into the hillside, carving out a level shelf in the snow above them. Remember that. That one small, sensible cut into the slope. Then they had dinner, climbed into their sleeping bags, and settled in for the night. That is the last moment in this entire story, where everything still makes ordinary sense. When the group missed their return date, search parties went up the mountain to look for them. On February 26th, they found the tent, half collapsed under fresh snow but still standing, and almost everything was still inside it. Their boots, their heavy coats, their food laid out like they'd been about to eat. Whatever happened, it happened so fast that 9 people left a warm tent in a Siberian night without grabbing the one thing that keeps you alive out there, their shoes. And then there were the cuts. The side of the tent had been slashed wide open. A seamstress was later brought in to examine the fabric, and she confirmed what the searchers already feared. The cuts were made from the inside. They didn't claw their way in. They cut their way out. So the searchers did the only thing they could. They followed the footprints leading away from the tent down toward the trees. And this is where it stops making sense, because those footprints don't look like people running for their lives. They're evenly spaced, steady, 8 or 9 sets of them walking about a mile down the slope toward the forest. Some of the prints were made by bare feet, some by a single sock, in 30 below cold. Nobody put on boots. Nobody grabbed a coat. They left the one warm place on that entire mountain, dressed for sleep, and they walked away from it in an orderly line. And remember, these were people who knew exactly what cold like that does to a body. They knew. So whatever drove them out of that tent, it was something they judged to be worse than freezing. What could possibly be worse than that? At the edge of the forest, under a tall old cedar tree, they found the first 2, barefoot, stripped down to their underwear. And above them, branches were snapped off that cedar as high as 5 meters up, meaning someone had climbed it in the dark in that cold with their bare hands. Maybe to break off wood, maybe to look back up the slope at the tent they'd left. Underneath were the ashes of a small, desperate fire. They had tried so hard to stay alive. It wasn't enough. Then spread out between the cedar and the tent, they found 3 more, including Igor Dyatlov himself. And every one of those 3 was lying with their head pointed back uphill. They had died trying to crawl back toward the shelter they had just cut their way out of. But that was only 5. 4 of them were still missing. And when they finally turned up 2 months later, they would rewrite the whole mystery. It took until May. When the snow began to melt, searchers found the last 4, buried under almost 4 meters of snow in a ravine lying in the bed of a frozen stream. And these 4 were different, wrong in a way that nobody could explain. One of them had a fractured skull. 2 others, Dubinina and a man named Semyon Zolotaryov, had catastrophic chest injuries, ribs broken on both sides of the body. One investigator said the force needed to do that was comparable to a car crash. And yet, here is the detail that broke people's minds for 60 years. There were almost no external wounds, no matching bruises, no broken skin. Something had crushed these people with the force of a speeding car and left the outside of their bodies nearly untouched. And Lyudmila Dubinina, when they found her, was missing her tongue and her eyes. Now put yourself in 1959. Look at what you've got. A force strong enough to shatter a ribcage, but somehow too gentle to bruise the skin. 9 experienced people fleeing a warm tent, barefoot, into a killing cold. A young woman missing her tongue. Faint traces of radiation found on a couple of their garments. And a Soviet government that slammed the case shut in under 3 months blamed it on, and I'm quoting the official file here, a compelling natural force that it pointedly refused to name and then sealed all the records. If you wanted the perfect recipe for a conspiracy theory, you could not possibly do better than this. And so people cooked them up. More than 70 of them. Secret weapons tests gone wrong. The KGB, escaped prisoners. The Yeti, aliens. For 60 years, that silence got filled with monsters. But every single one of those monster stories has the same fatal flaw. To make it work, you have to ignore the evidence. So let's actually do that. Let's look at the evidence, starting with the easy ones. Take the radiation. It sounds terrifying until you learn the details. It was faint, found on only a couple of pieces of clothing, nowhere near a fatal dose, and one of the hikers literally worked in the Soviet nuclear industry, where that kind of trace contamination on clothing was routine. Investigators looked at it and ruled it out as a cause of death. Then there's the missing tongue and eyes, the single detail that has launched 1,000 horror videos. Here's the part those videos leave out. Dubinina was found face down in running water under the snow for 3 months. And in those conditions, the soft tissue goes first. The tongue, the eyes, it's grim and it's sad. But it is not the work of a monster, it's the work of a stream. One by one, when you actually look, the supernatural answers fall apart in your hands. Which leaves the one question they were all invented to avoid. Why did 9 careful, experienced people cut their way out of a perfectly good tent and walk calmly to their own deaths? Because whatever the real answer is, it can't just explain one piece. It has to explain all of it at the same time. The calm, orderly walk, the bare feet in the snow, the crushed chests with no marks on the skin, the heads pointed back toward home. For 60 years, nobody could find a single answer that fit every one of those facts at once. The case just sat there. Reopened, then quietly closed, then reopened again, a wound the country couldn't stop touching. Until very recently, two completely separate things happened that finally cracked it open for good. In 2019, Russian prosecutors did something they almost never do. They officially reopened the case 60 years later, and in 2020 they announced their conclusion. It was an answer that, frankly, almost nobody wanted to hear. An avalanche. People hated it. They'd hated it for decades. The slope wasn't steep enough for a normal avalanche. The searchers hadn't seen any obvious avalanche debris. The bodies were found too far down. To a lot of people, it felt like the government doing in 2020 exactly what it had done in 1959, waving the whole painful thing away with a tidy official word. And maybe it would have stayed a dismissal forever. Except this time, two scientists, all the way over in Switzerland, decided they were going to stop arguing about it and actually run the numbers. Their names are Johann Gaum and Alexander Puzrin, a snow avalanche physicist and an engineer. And what they showed is that the doubters were right about a normal avalanche, and that's exactly why everyone had missed it, because this wasn't a normal avalanche. It was a slab. Now, remember that small, sensible thing they did to set up camp, cutting into the slope to make their tent flat. That cut quietly removed the support from underneath a slab of hard, wind-packed snow sitting on the hill above them. And all evening, brutal mountain winds kept loading more and more snow on top of that slab. It didn't fall right away. It waited. Hours later, in the pitch dark with everyone asleep, the slab finally let go. A block of dense, concrete-hard snow, maybe the size of a car, slid down and came to rest directly on top of the people sleeping in that tent. It didn't bury them like a movie avalanche. It pressed them, with crushing weight, down against the hard, frozen floor they were lying on. To prove a body could break that way, the scientists used old General Motors crash test data and snow simulation code originally built to animate the movie Frozen. And there is your impossible injury. A chest crushed between a heavy weight and a rigid floor. The snow spreads the load across the whole body, so the ribs shatter, but the skin barely bruises. And here's the thing about that answer. Once you have it, every single piece that felt supernatural stops being a mystery and starts being heartbreakingly logical. The slab hits in the dark. People are injured, the tent is collapsing and half buried, and they cannot dig a heavy snow block off in time. So they do the one fast thing left. They cut through the wall and get out. They carry their hurt friends downhill, away from the slope, because going back up is how an avalanche kills you. They reach the trees. They light a fire. They climb the cedar for wood and for a line of sight back to the tent. They dig a snow shelter in the ravine for the badly injured. They send their strongest back up toward the tent for the boots and coats they'll die without. And then slowly, in the dark, at 30 below, with no shoes and no chance, the mountain simply takes them, one at a time. Not in a panic, in order. Every move a correct, trained, sensible move. And it still wasn't enough. So that's the answer. After 60 years and 70 theories and a whole genre of monsters, the thing on Dead Mountain wasn't a yeti or a weapon or anything you could ever put a face to. It was snow and slope and physics and terrible luck. An ordinary mountain doing something almost invisible. The Russian prosecutor who finally closed the case said it better than I can. He said, "It was a heroic struggle. There was no panic, but they had no chance to save themselves." And I think that's the part actually worth carrying out of here. Not the mystery, them. 9 people who knew the cold, who did everything right, who carried their friends as far as their bare feet would take them, trying the entire time just to get back home. The mountain has their leader's name on it now. They call it Dyatlov Pass. Try to remember that it's the name of a 23-year-old kid who built a little stove so his friends wouldn't be cold. Thank you for staying with me. I'll see you in the next one.